Yeah, Shalom, Rabbi Asher.
Hi, Shavua Tov, Rabbi Asher.
Yeah, how are you doing?
Thank God. I've been watching a few of your videos on YouTube. Interesting stuff. I want to thank you for taking this time to speak with me.
No problem.
Can you tell me a little bit more about yourself?
I was basically born into a traditional Sunni Muslim family in Pakistan, and I was brought up with the traditional Islamic beliefs, going through the different stages of study, as I guess a Jewish boy would do in a yeshiva. I went to a mosque. I went to, other teachers who taught me Arabic and taught me about the Islamic faith, theology and other things. And so as I was coming up, I felt that there was something missing in my life, that something wasn't right about what I was doing. And I also felt that we were not from the place I was born. I just had a deep, a feeling that I wasn't from here. I was from somewhere else. But I didn't know where my parents were from. As I was young, nobody ever spoke about where we came from. All we knew that we were here. But then at some point as I grew up, I learned that the only word that was thrown around was India. So I learned that my parents were born in India. And then I added another dimension to my query of who are we? Where did we come from? How did we end up in Pakistan if we are from India? What happened? And that led me at that point, in a kind of a spiritual void. And I wanted to, I felt that God could speak to me. I felt that God could talk to me, and I wanted to hear God's voice. So I started to pray to God to speak to me. And of course, in Islamic theology, it is taught that God doesn't speak to man directly. He only speaks through his angels. There is no correlation of God and man. God cannot come down to speak to man, but when he needs to speak to man, he will send an intermediary. And so people will laugh at me, when I say to them, I would like to, God to speak, and they laugh at me. They're stupid. How can God?
Does that include prophets as well?
Yeah, that's right. That included prophets.
Okay, so just messengers in general. Okay.
Yeah, they would say that, look, even the messenger of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, they would say that even God didn't speak directly to him. How could he speak directly to you? Are you bigger than him? I would say, no, but I believe that the creator of the universe is not in a tin box. He can come out of that box and he can speak to me, just ordinary me as well. So, because, what my mother told me when I was young, my mother would say to me that you're special. But mother never explained to me what that special meant. And as I was growing up, my mother became ill, and when I was young, my mother died. I was kind of in my teens, and my mother died. So I kind of was left. What did my mother mean by that I'm special? What is our connection of our family? So we eventually, we migrated to England, and from there my search continued for God. And then one day, I took a bet with my friend. I said that I'm going to go to America, and he said, no way, you can't go there. I said, I'm going to go to America. He asked me, how much salary are you going to get when you go to America? I said, $50,000. I threw a figure in the air. $50,000. He says, no way, you won't make it. That was back in 1997. As a computer engineer, I picked up my phone one day. I phoned New York, and I said, I want a job. They offered me a job for $55,000. So I won the bet with my friend. I went over to New York. I worked there in the city for a little bit, and then I had some family issues with my son, who became...
Hold on. You were practicing Muslim this whole time, or you were falling away?
I was practicing Muslim all this time, and then I had to go back to England, but my quest for God never stopped. I always said for God to speak to me, and that quest carried on for 10 whole years of my life, from 23 onwards. And then one day, when I came back from America, I got a job in St. Paul in London in an investment bank, and I was there, and that is when I heard God's voice. I clearly heard God say to me, come and follow me. And I knew instantly that God had spoken to me. And I then questioned that voice. Who is that voice? Who is, this God who spoke to me? Is it Allah? Because Allah doesn't speak to man directly. He speaks through an intermediary, like an angel. And I was like, well, surely this can't be Allah. So I had already at that point decided that Islamic theology didn't fit the mold of this God speaking to me. It has to be somebody else. I didn't know who this God was, so I questioned. And whilst I was in the middle of this search period, God had already directed me. He said, "Go to Moses." You know, he told me that, and I said, "Who's Moses?" And I realized that Moses was a great prophet that led the children of Israel into the wilderness out of Egypt. So that led me into that direction, and that was basically my connection into Torah. And so when I heard this voice, and I asked God, and I said, "What about my family?" Because, you know, I realized that this wasn't the Islamic God I've been taught about. I realized that there was going to be a major seismic change in my life. I would, you know, have to make serious changes. Maybe my family won't accept me when I change. And I then decided that, you know, I have to do something which is right, truthful, factual. I can't, you know, now just say, "Oh, well, you know, I heard the voice, but it was maybe me speaking to myself." So that wasn't the only time I heard his voice. And then I went back to my home and I told my wife, "I have heard God's voice." And my wife said, my wife laughed at my face. "You've gone mad." "You sure you heard God's voice?" You know, making it up. I said, no, I heard God's voice and I'm going to follow that God. And she said to me, "But, you know, what will the family say? What's going to happen? You know, everybody's going to say that you're leaving Islam." He said, "What are you going to do with Islam?" I said, "Nothing." I said, I'm going to leave Islam and I'm going to follow this God, whoever he is. I don't know much about him yet, but I know that, you know, he will lead me into the way." So that was my quest. That was my start of my journey. And then that led me into my family, back into Pakistan, asking further questions. Who are we? Eventually I found out we were Persian Jews from the Levites, Kohanim family. And that's how then I kind of went from there. You know, I kind of stepped into Christianity thinking that, you know, maybe this God was Christian God. And from Christianity, God led me out into Torah.
What's the word? What's the word that you just used? That we were what Jews?
Persian Jews.
Oh, Persian Jews. Persians.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're from the Persian Jews because I found out from my father when I went back to Pakistan to inquire. And my father was there at the time. I said to him, "Who are we? Where did we come from? You know, surely we're not from Pakistan and we're not from India either. So where are my forefathers from?" That's when I was having a discussion with my father and my cousin, and she was trying to tell me the merits of Islam. My father told her, "No, don't tell him anything. This man has gone back to the faith of his forefathers, the Jews." And that's when I clicked that, okay, so we are not, you know, Muslims per se from start. And I knew that was the original question that I had. Who are we? How did we end up in Pakistan? And then my father told me that I was 6 years old when we had the 1947 partition, India and Pakistan splitting up as two nations. You know, you weren't even born. I was a young little boy. I had to leave my family. I had to leave my grandfather, me, my father, my sisters. He was the only son. They had to escape as refugees out of India for their lives, and they went into India because, you know, killing spree started in India. Many people were killed across the civil war. So they crossed into Pakistan. We had many thousands of acres of land in India. We lost all of that. And I so then later learned that who we were as a people. But then my family never wanted to talk about that past because it was seen as almost like a thing that nobody wanted to discuss because it's some kind of a stigma or it was a threat to their lives. So they kept it quiet. Never spoke about it.
Mm-hmm. If you decided to go back to Pakistan to visit, would they try to persecute you for leaving Islam?
You know, to be honest, when I came to faith in the God of Israel, who I came to know who he was, because he didn't give me a name at the time. He did give me the name afterwards. And I realized that I had a mission with him. And I didn't go to Israel at the time. I had the money and the time to go there. But I said I will only go to Israel when God calls me. And at that point, God had already directed me. You know, he first called me to Israel and he directed me. He said, you will be like Moses. You will stick your rod into the ground and living waters will rise up and you will open the eyes of the people and you will go from nation to nation declaring my name. And at that point, was the name Yahweh. You know, at that point, I then went back to England, and then I went to America to speak to some Messianic Christians about the God that had called me out. And at that point, some Christians then were there prophesying, and they also confirmed what I'd already been told. And so at that point, God had directed me. He said, I'm going to open the doors for you, and no one can shut them. You can walk through those doors, and you can come out safely. So I knew at that point that my life would be in God's hands. I had no fear of entering any country and coming out alive. And so therefore I went. I went to Israel. I went to Palestinian regions, rough regions of, Israel, where, the Palestinian terrorists live. I went into the desert. I was all over the place. I was a very fortunate and guy that had God on my side. So I never got persecuted. No one ever touched me. And I got excellent treatment wherever I went. In fact, I want to tell you a testimony, a really incredible testimony. I used to say that I'm not going to go to the mountain, let the mountain come to me. So, there's a saying that Muhammad went to the mountain didn't come to him. So I had to say, no, let the mountain come to me. I'm special. And so what happened, I had a man from Saudi Arabia contact me, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. He took me in secrecy. He said, you must never reveal my name, but I want to meet you in London. So I said, okay, where do you want to meet me? And so he invited me to a hotel. This was an Arab gentleman. He came over there, and my family at the time, when I was married, and I lost my marriage after a while, but my wife told me not to go because she's afraid somebody will kill me over there. And I said, no, I must go. And, my life is in God's hands. If God can't protect me, then no one can. And, I was also a black belt, second degree black belt taekwondo champion. So I said, I don't really care. I'm going in. So I went, and I met this guy, really good gentleman. He became a friend of mine. He told me that his history, he told me that he was from the lineage of the Prophet. And I couldn't believe it first. I thought, you sure? He said, yeah. He said, I am from his daughter Fatima, that particular family. And I said, I must take you home because nobody will believe me that you came to me. I said, the mountain came to me. I didn't go to the mountain. That's what I used to say. So I said, I must take you home. Otherwise my wife will say I made it up. And he said, okay. I said, you must come with me to my house even for 1 hour, and I'll drop you back at the hotel when we finish in London. So I took him home. I introduced him to my wife. My wife was shocked. She said, how can that be? How can this man who is a Muslim, who's from Saudi Arabia, come to you? I said, well, I'm special. That's all I'll tell you. Because God has allotted me this time. God has opened the door between East and West, and I can walk through those doors, and I can go in, and I can go into those doors, and I can come out safely. I said, he's in front of you. I didn't make it up. Look at this man. I didn't, call him. He came himself. He'll tell you. You know what the man said to me? He said, I want to follow the faith that you have. I want you to tell me about God. That's what the man told me. I said, okay, I will tell you about God. And this is how that man converted. So...
He converted to Judaism.
At the time, he converted into what he believed to be the truth was Christianity, Messianic Christianity, but I told him later that it was Torah Judaism that God had called me into. Yes, I had stepped temporarily into Christianity because that's where God wanted me for that particular time, but I wasn't meant to be there forever because I had gone to Golders Green. A man had taken me there. I had never been to Golders Green, it's a Jewish area in London, and a man took me there to Messianic temple, Messianic chapel, and from there I basically left into Torah Judaism. So that was
Shabbos in Golders Green.
Yeah.
Interesting. Today, what do you consider yourself? Is there a box that you fit into or playing toward Judaism?
I would say that there is no box that I fit into because God didn't fit me into a box. God gave me Torah, and God told me, any time that God spoke to me, He emphasized on one point: keep my commandments, obey my word, and that's what God told me: teach my word. So I, strictly follow Torah Judaism, not Rabbinic Judaism. I don't follow Rabbinic Judaism. I know about it. I learned it. I've studied it. Talmud, the Mishnah, and Rambam, and all these other books. But I'll tell you one thing: they contradict the Torah at many times. So I don't follow those. I may respect the people who wrote them, but I certainly don't follow them to heart because my requirement, my remit as a Kohen was to follow the Torah and teach it, and that's what I do. And so also, my ministry, my call was Jeremiah 6:16 that God gave me. Thus says Yahuwah, stand in the ways and look intently and make inquiry for the ancient paths, where the good way is, and walk in it. There you will find rest for your souls. So that's the one he gave me, and that is my purpose, to take this scripture to the people, to the, what they call the lost tribes. They're not lost, they're in the east. And so I take this to the people, and I actually went to Pakistan. This time around I went to Pakistan, and I met people from the tribe of Benjamin, people from the tribe of Judah. I met them, I converted them back into the faith of Israel. They relayed the dreams to me, the dreams that they had. One person who became my student, he told me about the dreams that he had, that he saw himself in an Egyptian dress, of ancient Egyptian dress, and that he kept having this dream recurrently. And I told him, I said, you are seeing this dream because you're from the tribe of Judah that was in Egypt at one time. And he said, I kept seeing the dreams of lions. I said, lion is associated with the tribe of Judah. So I had a woman tell me exactly the same thing, that she kept having, seeing visions of lions at her doorstep. This is a Muslim woman. And I had the privilege to convert that Muslim woman to Torah Judaism as well. But she's a secret, she's a secret believer. And so this is my mission. My mission is to bring people to the truth, exactly what God said. As Moses was going around, teaching people the Torah and bringing them to the truth, God said that you will do the same thing. And so I realized in a number of ways that God showed me that my tribal lineage was Levite, and that we were situated in Persia, and that's where majority of my family lived. And we never went back to Israel. So I learned later that our families never went back to Israel at the reconstruction or the repair of the temple that occurred during Ezra's time. We stayed in Persia, and from Persia, some of our family moved to India. We purchased a lot of lands over there. We had family in Iran. We had family in India. But then from India, with this partition in 1947 between the two countries that the British did, we ended up in Pakistan. And I was born in Pakistan after that. And then all of my family migrated from there on and ended up in England. And from England, I ended up in America. But let me tell you one thing. I basically lost my marriage with my first wife for following the faith of the God of Israel. That was my first, downfall. I lost my children. I lost my home. I gave everything up to follow God. After that, I had a 6-figure salary. After that, I had another 6-figure salary. Years later, when God gave me everything back, I had homes, I had cars, I had everything. And then after that, one day, because I knew God was going to take me to America one day. I had come to America before, and I knew it was going to happen again. I just knew it. And then what happened? One day, God said to me, I was on a 6-figure salary in England, and God said to me, pick up your bags, and you are leaving England. You're going to North America. And I gave my notice to my workplace. I told my supervisor over there, I have to leave. She said to me, is there anything wrong? I said, there's nothing wrong. God has called me out. I have to go. And so I resigned from my job, and I went and I came to North America. That was roughly 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. So here I am since then, back and forth. And, that's how I operate. I operate when God tells me to do something, I go do it. I don't ask questions why, how. God shows me how to do it, I just do it.
Very, very similar to Abraham in Parshas Lech Lecha. You picked up and went from where you were to where God wanted you to be. Well, my story is not as exciting as yours. I wasn't born Jewish. I converted to Judaism.
Right. And I heard of your testimony as well, that you came out of Christianity.
Yes, I came out of Christianity. As a kid, my family wasn't really religious. I grew up like a street kid. I was a gang member, drug dealer. And then when I turned 18, I wanted to give back. I wanted to harness that energy I had to make a name for myself, to get known, to be popular. I wanted to harness that energy and redirect it in a positive direction to make the world a little better, at least a little better than I found it, because I felt that I was contributing to its destruction. So I started in the religion of my parents, in the religion I knew about. My family wasn't really religious, but I know that they were Christian. My father was Catholic, my mother was Protestant, and I actually had a Christian uncle.
Did you get persecuted for leaving your faith at that time?
I didn't leave my faith. I didn't have any faith. I came from being a street kid to studying the Bible in a seminary. That's one of the great things about living in this country, that someone could change their religious disposition and not face any political persecution. But I took off running. I went to seminary, and I was involved in street ministry. I always wanted to do things that were sort of extreme, so I did something that most people don't like to do. I focused on the homeless, prostitutes, gang members, trying to make them better with what I thought was the gospel.
Right.
Anyways, in my journey and in my studies, I realized that the New Testament didn't really coincide with what Christians call the Old Testament. And this is before the internet. People have it easy nowadays. Searchers have it easy. Back then we had to buy books.
The old days you didn't have the internet. You had to read through reams and reams.
Right. If we liked the song on the radio, we had to buy a record or a cassette. Couldn't just listen to it on YouTube.
True.
But anyways, I slowly started dismantling and dissecting what I initially believed to be true religiously. And I found myself not believing that Jesus was God or the Messiah, but still believing in the God of Israel. So that's how I felt that I was forced to become Jewish. I'm not even to today do I accept this idea of the 7 laws of Noah as an alternative to true Torah.
Yes.
So I went to my local synagogue.
That's just a rabbinic, terminology. There's no validity of that in scriptures.
For sure. I accept the oral law, and I'll explain that a little further in a bit, but I don't think that the 7 laws of Noah, as developed by the Sanhedrin, is an alternative to any modern-day ethical religious system, be it Judaism, Christian, or Islam. Perhaps if you're living in the Bronze Age, yes, keep the 7 laws and you aspire above your neighbors.
You can't practice the alleged 7 laws of Noah even in the Gentiles, because you'd have to kill a Gentile for adultery, and that doesn't happen.
You'd have to kill him for breaking any of the 7 laws according to rabbinic Judaism. But
right.
I went to my local synagogue and I just said I want to convert. And it took me about 3 years. It was initially a Sephardi synagogue, and I converted.
Did they accept you? Because normally, Jewish synagogues don't take people for conversion in first, second time, maybe third time round.
What do you mean a second time?
I mean, when you normally go and say, I want to become Jewish, they usually reject you.
Right. Some places do that. There's a myth that rabbis are supposed to turn your way 3 times, but that's just a myth. Right. It's not in Jewish law. So most rabbis actually don't do that. But the rabbi just told me, keep coming, and I did. I converted, then I moved to Israel. I learned in yeshiva there. I've always dreamt about Israel and the ancient biblical sites. Of course, I had a big shock when I got there. I lived in Israel for 5 years. I made Aliyah, and Israel's a great place, but it's a secular country, and that's what people don't know, that if you leave Jerusalem, right?
What made you, because, I asked this question intently, because what made you leave? The reason why I say that is, when I went to Israel in 2004, I asked God there, I said, do you want me to come into Israel and stay here? And God told me emphatically, no, I want you in the nations. So I never dreamt about living in Israel. So
I went initially to learn in yeshiva. When you convert to Judaism, there's a lot of doors that open for you, especially academically.
Right.
Even if you don't have money, you could pretty much learn in any yeshiva, eat there, live there, and
which is good. Yes.
Absolutely. Learn the language, and when you're ready, they'll find you a wife. It's really a great thing. This is why anyone interested, in my opinion, in Judaism in any way, should just get that conversion paper. Even immigrating to Israel. I'm an Israeli citizen now. In case I want to go back, I could. Right. But I was there for about 2 years, and I came back to the U.S. after I learned enough. And about 1.5 years after that, I officially immigrated to Israel.
Right.
Initially because I really bought into the Zionist, the religious Zionist ideology, which I don't really embrace nowadays.
I've heard about it.
I support Israel like I support any democracy, but I don't in any way think that it's the final piece in the messianic puzzle, and Israelis today are the resurrection of biblical Israel. It's a secular country, and it's easy to romanticize Israel if you don't live there. I would say the U.S. is a lot more religious than Israel is. And Israel is a very secular place.
A lot less racist as well.
They're racist for primitive reasons. In other words, they really aren't exposed to people who look different than they do. There are Ethiopians, but they typically stay in little segments in Kiryat Malachi and these small little villages, but they also get mistreated, and it's really because they typically don't meet people who don't look like they do. They is not just white. They could be Middle Eastern. They're used to seeing people who look Iraqi, people who look Moroccan. But if you're Sudanese, you stand out. Yes, and there's racism there.
It's awkward, and black Jews are, I think, quite awkward to live there. But what I've seen is there's a lot of racism against black Jews from Ethiopia and other, parts of different African nations. Having said that, what I felt, when I went to Israel, is that I didn't personally get any racism myself, but I have seen, the conflict between the Palestinians and the Jews over there, and it kind of spills over. And, you got these lines, where you can go in, and if you're Jewish, they'll attack you and vice versa.
But that's not a race issue. Honestly, you can't really distinguish a Palestinian from an Israeli. And you look like a Yemenite Jew. It's really for those who don't look like the average Israelis, or really a form of xenophobia than actual racism.
Yes.
It's not intentional. I mean, for sure not endorsed by the government.
Absolutely not. But I still think that Israel, because it's a secular government, Israel has a long way to go for equality. Even as a secular government, it's not quite equal as it should be, compared to the West. Like, if you were living in England, I've lived in England many years of my life. I've never had issue with racism or equality issues, but that in some countries is very prevalent.
Mm-hmm. They have a harder job dealing with that problem because if everyone was treated equally, the Arabs, they reproduce faster than the Israelis do, but the Arabs will one day just vote the Israelis out of the state. In other words, it's hard to claim to be a Jewish country and be a democracy at the same time. And I understand that's very difficult to do and remain a Jewish country. Thing is, those who initially called it a Jewish country didn't believe in God. So Jewish to them was more of a race/ethnicity than religious disposition. So that's a problem. It's easy to explain, but it's hard to solve.
Right.
I mean, what do you do, right? So you had some people like the late great Rabbi Meir Kahana who just suggested, let's just drive all the Arabs into Egypt or into the Jordan. Not the river, but the country. They really have their hands full there on what to do.
I think part of the problem is that the Jews that are in Israel, predominantly Ashkenazi, as you know, the Holocaust in Germany, that kind of made them a little apprehensive from other people. So maybe that's one of the reasons that they're like that. They are afraid of, mixing with other people.
These were secular Jews who ultimately didn't mind marrying outside of their group. But Hitler considered you Jewish. I think if you were 1/16 Jewish, I don't think secular Jews initially would strive to marry other Jews. They just, for some reason, found themselves marrying like-minded individuals, i.e. Jews, and this is why they preserve their identity. But in places like Germany, they were absorbed into the society completely after 3 or 4 generations.
Right, yeah.
Now, this is one problem with having a state of Israel. Assimilation is not always a bad thing. Why? Because it helps us weed out the bad blood. Today in Israel, we have Jews proudly claiming to be 5, 6, 7 generations Jewish and secular. Now this, in the exile, wouldn't happen. Why? Because you eventually marry out and lose any sense of your Jewishness, which is actually a good thing. But now you have a lot of left-wing, irreligious ideas coming from Israelis who the vast majority of non-Jews in the world cannot distinguish from a religious Jew. I mean, I would say the vast majority of Gentiles cannot tell the difference between a religious Jew and a secular Jew. Right? I mean, they think you're Jewish, you're the people of God, right? But they don't understand that according to Torah, one could be cut off from his people. Only because you happen to have a Jewish mother doesn't mean that you're in the covenant with God if you walk away from the covenant. Now, someone could return just as quick as someone could convert, but it skews the line.
Right, but do you believe that, like Christians do, that the tribes have been restored, in your opinion? What do you think about that?
I think...
Because, from what I've seen out there, in the nations, that I've traveled many countries, since I've found, or at least you said God found me. I've been, nearly to 30 countries, but I have not seen, I've seen the population in Israel, been there several times, but I've also noted that the 10 tribes are still missing in action, and even many Jews, tribes of Yehuda and tribes of Benjamin are still outside in the nations.
Mm-hmm. I don't believe that's important. In other words, they may be ethnically part of some tribe, but I don't think that in any way ties them into the covenant. I think ethnicity, race is completely unimportant to God. Why should we assume that someone deserves special treatment just because of who their ancestor was? So we have a notion of people from other nations entering the people of Israel and being just as important to the Almighty as someone who's a direct descendant of Moses.
Wouldn't you say then that the covenant that was given to Abraham, then repeated to Isaac and Jacob, is important to God? In retrospect way, that the children that come from the loins of those patriarchs are also important to God. I would firmly believe in that.
I think that would state that God in some way has favorites and people are born intrinsically superior to others. Now, we know that Isaac was a child of the covenant, but we also know that Esav came through Isaac and ultimately Amalek and Edom. Now, I don't think there's any Israelite who walks around thinking that the Edomites or the Amalekites are their spiritual brothers. And they may be ethnically related, but only because you're born from the child of the covenant doesn't mean that you are in that covenant. Now, you can be Israel, genetically Israel, for example. There is a strength in ethnicity, a social strength, a group nowadays. Anything could be in ethnicity, but that doesn't mean that you're in the covenant. I think that even when God calls Israel or the Hebrews out of Egypt, it seems that he's just putting the word out, right? And he's accepting anyone who comes out. As it says that they left Egypt with a mixed multitude. Now, there's many rabbis who... Go ahead.
When Israel was brought out of Egypt, and then the Egyptians, naturally born Egyptians who were not Israelites, also joined onto Israel at that point. But as you know that, when we read the Torah, they didn't adhere to the covenant.
How do you know that?
Because you read about it, and read about the golden calf. Part of the problem was the Egyptian priests in the midst.
It doesn't make that statement. Now, it may use the word Erev Rav twice. Erev Rav is just a descriptive term, a mixed multitude. That mixed multitude, or that multitude that you brought out of Egypt, included Hebrews and Hittites and many other people who were slaves also in Egypt. But I don't think that the argument made by mystical Judaism and Midrashim and Agadot that the Erev Rav in some way were the ones who created the golden calf and they were killed off by the Levites, I don't buy into that idea. I think it's just an easy way out, saying that those who had Hebrew blood were in some way incapable of sinning, because we know that Israel continued to sin even after the whole issue of the golden calf. How will that make sense? I mean, once they killed off the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude, what was their excuse then?
Yeah, but Rabbi Asher, you know why Israel continued to sin? Because it continued to marry into the nations. That was one of the biggest issues. Mixing. And that caused a lot of problems. I mean, you look at King Ahav, the Malach Ahav, how he married into the nations and what happened there.
I'm talking about before they entered the land of Israel. In Torah itself, they were constantly complaining, even after they received the Torah, because the golden calf was right at the Sinai experience, not afterwards. So I'd like to ask any mystic who tries to say that the problem with post-Exodus Israel was the mixed multitude. What happened when that mixed multitude supposedly was wiped out because of their idolatry or whatever they were encouraging? I mean, whose fault was it then? In other words, I believe that they use the story of the mixed multitude as a scapegoat to in some way say that Jews are intrinsically incapable of doing wrong. But it's not true. I believe that the Almighty used Israel, saying that, you know what, if I could use them, I could use anybody.
What you're saying is potentially true, because you had other people in the mix, like Caleb, who was also a convert, but he turned out to be a righteous man, and got the inheritance from the tribe.
Caleb, you said.
Caleb, yeah.
Yeah, Caleb. I believe that, by the way. Most Jews do not believe that he was a convert. But I do believe he was a convert, by the way. We're kindred spirits in that.
Judaism today is all over the place. They have no really firm belief, because what I have found in Judaism is you've got about 15 different Judaisms out there. Everybody's making their own Torah. What the Torah says, very few of them even bother to keep that. So, I really don't really even look at them for truth. For us and for me especially, truth is in the books that Moses wrote, and it's plain black and white. And yes, sometimes you may have to look into what the ancients believed or how the rabbis interpreted something, but I can tell you that even the rabbis never quite agreed with each other. And, the Talmud is full of arguments and discussions, and this rabbi said this and that rabbi said that. Nobody ever comes to a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So, do you believe that blood is important to God?
I do not believe that blood is important, but I believe that covenant is important to God, and anybody that enters that covenant, irrespective of what racial ethnicity they are today, even if they were not born Jewish, that person is important to God.
Can they break that covenant?
The covenant that was given to Abraham, because Abraham was told that you will become, you will be a father to a multitude of nations, and they will be engrafted through you, blessed through you, and engrafted as well. So I believe that applies to the whole world. Not necessarily that the whole world is going to convert, but there will be people from the whole world, including Gentile world, that will become righteous servants to the Most High. I believe that.
I believe that as well. However, I also know that the Torah uses the word karet, the word to cut off. And it says that if an Israelite does thus and thus, he shall be cut off from his people. And there's even one place in Parshat Nitzavim that says that I will cut him off from above and below. So not just will he be cut off from the people of Israel, but I will cut him off. Now, I know the Torah itself doesn't mention an afterlife too explicitly, but there's something with excising, with pulling out someone of the people of Israel who happened to initially be in some covenant. So I don't think once in the covenant, always in the covenant.
The adherence, to the covenant is, as you know, that you can't just say that you're in the covenant, because you have to then also be compliant to the covenant. What is required? You can't be doing, you can't be in Christianity and say I'm in the covenant, because it just doesn't work like that, or Islam for that matter. Mm-hmm. But then, God has put people and hidden people in Christianity and in Islam. So I believe firmly that God has hidden his people in those religions for a purpose, because he wants to protect his people, and he will call them out when their appointments are up. Just as my family were hidden away, and he called me out when the time was up. I believe that will occur as God's appointed time, not our appointed time. I mean, we can't say, everybody convert to Torah, because that's not going to happen. It will only happen when God calls people out.
I think that God would have called you out even though you didn't have one speck of Jewish blood. Just like he spoke to Abraham. I mean, he didn't really speak to Abraham because he was ultimately from some special pedigree. He spoke to Abraham like he speaks to everyone. But the difference is that Abraham listened. And
I agree with that.
Abraham came from a family of idol worshippers. This is why I'm not big on people pointing that these people are from a certain tribe or that people are from that tribe, because it ultimately doesn't matter. If you're not keeping Torah, you're not important to God. It says in Torah that if you keep my commandments, then you'll be my Am Segula, my treasured people. Yes. It's completely not important. I think that there's too much special treatment being thrown around.
No, but it will become important when the third temple is restored, At that point, it will become important. May not be important now, but it will become important because the Levites have to be separated, the tribes have to be separated, lands have to be given according to Ezekiel's prophecies, chapter 47, 48. So these things are going to be important down the road. Maybe not right now, but they are going to be ultimately important.
There's a lot of laws that were given to us that no longer apply because of our circumstances. For example, God doesn't punish us for not having a temple because He made us not have a temple. If Israel was still offering sacrifices on the Mizbeach in the Beit HaMikdash when there were no northern tribes. So I think that within Judaism is contained certain clauses that keeps it progressing, even though it's missing certain things. Even during the Second Temple, there was no Ark of the Covenant. However, the priest would still go through the motions like it was there. Didn't really nullify the Torah because it was missing. Ultimately, the Almighty intended it not to be there for whatever reason. I think that anyone should be given the same ability to enter Israel than someone claiming to have some royal pedigree. Now, yes, mind you, I understand that we have Kohanim and we have Leviim and certain people have certain roles, but I don't think that a Kohen is in any way any more special to the Almighty than an Israelite. As a matter of fact, there isn't one act, ethical act, that a Kohen is commanded to do that an Israelite is not commanded to do. The only differences between the practices, the extra laws that Kohanim have are ceremonial laws.
I would disagree with that because the Kohanim are asked to do the redemption ceremony, the Pidiyah Haben. Only the Kohen can do that. No Israelites can.
Absolutely. But that's not ethical. That's ceremonial.
Yeah, ceremonial.
The distinction, right. There's no ethical act. In other words, Kohanim are held to the same level as Israelites are in ethics and morality. Obviously, they have different ceremonial acts. I mean, there are things, notion that Mashiach has to come from the tribe of Judah. Now, does that mean that those from Judah are in some way intrinsically special? No, there are certain offices that the Almighty placed on certain tribes. But in terms of ethics, we're all held to the same standard. That means that anyone...
I think that's true.
This is why I don't buy this whole lost tribe thing. There's this rabbi named Rabbi Laser Brody.
Yeah.
He has a blog called Laser Beams, and he posted a picture of the Pashtuns in Afghanistan, and he placed a caption that said, "Good Jewish boy." And I'm like, these individuals are Muslim. That in itself doesn't make him evil, but right at that moment, that rabbi began to view the world tribally instead of ethically. And I think...
But you know that the Pashtun, there's a lot of Jewish blood there.
I'm not debating that, but he wrote, "Good Jewish boy." He's separating the world between ethnically Jewish and ethnically Gentile versus good and evil. And if people...
I think that's just maybe the rabbi's opinion that he tried to do that, but really I think in God's sight, I mean, equally that Pashtun has an equal chance of being redeemed and being in Israel in the world to come than anybody else that's out there, irrespective of, whether they're in Afghanistan or whether they're in Timbuktu. It doesn't matter.
So why mention it then?
I think maybe he's trying to draw a point. I don't know, his ideology and why he drew that point, but to me, I don't think we can look at the world in such a narrow lens and then, make such comments.
We know that someone could be absorbed into the tribes as well. You mentioned Caleb being a convert. Now, Caleb represented the tribe of Judah during the whole ordeal of the Meraglim. Why? Because he was absorbed into the tribe. So if you have one individual who could in some way genetically trace a pedigree back to Ephraim or Manasseh, that individual could absorb 1 million converts into his shavits and in some way...
That is potentially true, as it happened.
Some way we could practice a Yovel year and all the other festivals that require the tribes to be back.
I believe so. I believe that certain individuals in the past, it happened to them, and also in the future, present or future, that many individuals will get absorbed into different tribes. That would happen ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Nowadays, in the Orthodox world, there is the outreach, kiruv. Now, this is a new thing. 500 years ago, religious Jews didn't feel an obligation to their secular counterparts. Throughout Jewish history, once an Israelite left Torah, his parents in many cases would sit shiva for him,
Right.
and he wouldn't be included as part of Israel. But since the rise of Kabbalah, which believes that there's some notion of a Jewish soul. Now, the Talmud never mentions a Jewish soul. This is something created by the Zohar and stuff like that.
I don't believe in all that anyway.
Right. So they themselves also spent millions of dollars trying to redeem or win back secular Jews just because they have Jewish blood. Now, this is the problem. Again, because the world sees this, that we ultimately only care about people who claim to be part of us. Now, secular Jews view religious Jews like parasites, but religious Jews nowadays, they bend over backwards for secular Jews. I mean, trying to win them back.
You know, when God called me out, that wasn't my remit to go after Jews. He told me to go to the nations, and anybody that has an ear to hear, they can come into the Torah. That was my remit. So therefore, you're right about, secular Jews versus religious Jews. And other religious Jews, I've seen, many teachers out there, rabbis out there, that are reaching out to secular Jews to convert them back. They think that they have their ministries, related to that. Like there's a Rabbi Mizrahi, as you know, in New York. He does the same. He reaches out to secular Jews. He wants them to come back into rabbinic Judaism. But again, you see, that I believe is more a personal opinion of the person. It's not God's opinion, by the way, and it's not a Torah opinion either. It's not what God said. It's what the person, it's what the rabbi said. So I take God's word literally when God says to Abraham that I will, join nations unto you. Well, they're not Jews, by the way. They were never Jews by blood. If nations are going to join unto Abraham, that means intrinsically they would have to have potentially no Jewish blood to start with. And maybe, maybe there would be people from the tribes that are out there, and maybe they'll come back, return as well, because they're meant to, as Isaiah 11, chapter 11, verse 11 says, that God will restore the tribes. Second time round, He'll pick them from these different nations that are all, by the way, intrinsically in the East. So, having said that, and parts of Africa, therefore, I believe that this ideology that you have to reach out to Jews only is, personally for me, that doesn't hold no water.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't consider that as a prophecy that in some way wasn't fulfilled. We know that the whole context around the book of Isaiah was the kingdom of Assyria trying to capture Judah just like they captured the northern tribes. So in and around the time of Isaiah, there were Israelites in Assyria and many other places dispersed by Assyria because they, whether they're Jewish or not, or Israelite or not, I wouldn't say, but
per se. Let me tell you one thing, a very, very interesting, a true story about Assyria. Assyrian Empire, ranged from southeastern Turkey all the way to Pakistan. It includes Afghanistan, parts of India. I met a person who became my student from Pakistan who had left Baghdad, in Iraq 2,000 years ago. 8 Jewish families traveled from Baghdad to what was then known as India, ancient India. They crossed over to Kashmir, and then they crossed over to Pakistan. And that man, today, all his family are Muslim, and he came out of Islam back to Torah Judaism. So I know there are families there that actually know their lineage, they know their ancestry, but for all practical purposes, because, the country is Muslim, they're not going to turn around and say we're Jews from Israel, because they'll be killed. So
my point was that in Isaiah's time, there was still hope that those who were taken into exile would repent. Right. However, the Almighty would not have overridden their free will and stated they were never coming back. In other words, there was still a time for them to come back, as it states in Deuteronomy chapter 28, 29, and 30, and Leviticus chapter 26, that there's a formula to exile and redemption. So we know that disobedience to Torah causes exile.
Yes.
Then there's prophetic intervention. That means the Almighty sends you a prophet. So we have Isaiah, we have Jeremiah, right? If you don't listen to that prophet, that ultimately leads to your exile. When you do turn back to the Almighty, when you soften your heart, when you ask for repentance, the Almighty will bring you back and reestablish your former glory. But these are the individuals, or even the children of the individuals, who had some sort of recollection of the sin that put them where they were. So in the time of Isaiah, these individuals still had an ability to come back. But now, where the only thing that ties these individuals to their biblical ancestors is blood, these individuals have no recollection of the God of Israel. I mean, they could. No. They are part of the nations. Why would the Almighty now, in some way, show favoritism only because of DNA? It just makes no sense when the Almighty is so adamant about merit being assigned because of action and ultimately belief, but how those beliefs cause you to behave in a certain way. So this is why it's completely, I mean, I think it hurts the cause to potential future converts of entering Judaism when we let them know that we even care that some individual in Africa or in Afghanistan is in some way elevated just because of blood or just because of DNA.
I don't think the issue here is blood, but also the issue here is there's a couple of other issues in the nations, such as in Islamic nations. When you leave Islam, you can get killed for that. So in Afghanistan and in the Pashtun regions, in northern Pakistan, where I have met, several Pashtuns, and they know who they are, by the way. They're not, ignorant of their roots. They know they're from the Davidic, they say they're from the Davidic tribes, or they are the sons of Yosef. The children of Yosef. They know that. They're called Yosef Zai over there. And they're also called the Davidic tribe. There's the Star of David there in their homes. Their wives have a custom of lighting candles for on the evening of the Shabbat. So having said that, they don't return back to the God of Israel because they don't have no knowledge left of who they were other than customs. So it's really up to God. Who is God going to send to tell them who they are? So or is God going to send His Ruach, His Spirit upon them to get them to know there are certain individuals?
I don't think the Almighty cares about us knowing who we are, but He cares about us knowing what we could become. This is the whole basis of the Jewish experiment. In other words, when the Almighty called Abraham to be the father of a nation unlike any other nation, meant that back then, somebody's citizenship was his religion, and their king was their God. So in other words, an Israelite could worship foreign gods. He could worship the God of the Philistines, but he would never become a Philistine.
That's true.
Why? Because he wasn't part of that country. Now, it wasn't like that with the God of the Hebrews.
Right.
It ultimately didn't matter who your mother was, what part of the world you came from. You joined the Jewish people, you were a 100% inheritor of every blessing that appears in the Torah. Now,
that's true.
So we are in some way going back. We're reversing the whole biblical narrative, saying now blood matters, or DNA matters, or ethnicity matters. Nothing matters. It's picking up from where you're at and going to where God wants you to be. And that's what made Abraham great, and that's what makes us great today. I mean, there's many analogies with ancient biblical Israel and the United States and how the United States was formed. Taking people from anywhere in the world, we don't care where you're from. We care what you can produce.
Right.
Same thing with Israel. The job of being an Israelite, being an ambassador of God, being the right hand of God on this earth is making the world a better place.
Okay, well, let me put you somewhere so you can answer this question. If blood doesn't matter at all, then why does God say in Ezekiel chapter 37 that He will raise up the people, the tribes, and their bones will be put together as flesh? And I know that Rabbinic Judaism and I know Christians, they like to gloss over those interpretations, and they come out with all sorts of fancy interpretations. But really, let's take it for black and white, what the Tanakh says, what the prophet Ezekiel says, that thus says Master Yahweh or Shem to these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall have life. Well, who are these people if they're not Israelites of blood?
That was an analogy of people in exile. Don't forget, Ezekiel was in Babylon, and Ezekiel was prophesying even before the second temple was built, right? I mean, Ezekiel witnessed the first destruction. So, the valley of dry bones is analogous to his mission to his people in Babylon. He said, prophesy to them, i.e. prophesy to those who are in Babylon. And just like these bones could come back to life, those who are dead spiritually in Babylon could return back to Israel. And it really ties into Daniel chapter 12, that many people try to interpret as the resurrection of the dead, that some will rise to good things and others to contempt that lasts a long time. So
I would have to disagree with part of the interpretation, because verse 10 says, so I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood up upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. Well, that hasn't happened. So
no, because it was a prophecy. Now, the understanding is that many of these prophecies occur in dreams. It's analogous of what was happening with Israel at that time. But you have to understand that there was a context at work there. Ezekiel's job was to bring Israel back to Torah. And by then coming back to Torah, we see that through Ezra and Nehemiah, they were allowed to return into the land and build the temple again. Why would he be prophesying to a people about something that did not specifically apply to them? Now, the people ultimately did return. Now, I understand that it makes reference to the two sticks, right?
Yes.
But again, that's not overriding the free will that Northern Kingdom had to return to Torah. They decided not to return. Now, we know that many of them did return under King Josiah. And the idea is that Jeremiah brought people from the lost tribes or the scattered tribes back into the kingdom of Judah. So some say that is, in some way, that prophecy acted out.
Okay, I don't think that's ever happened. That prophecy has never been fulfilled, the two sticks joining together. That's still yet to be done.
Right. Well, it's a conditional prophecy. I mean, every promise and every prophecy is conditional. In other words, if the Almighty promises you prosperity, it's prosperity if you keep Torah. If he promises you a curse, it's a curse if you fail to return to Torah.
But where do you see the condition there?
Every prophecy is conditional. If not, it's not just.
No.
Here, for example, here when Jonah is prophesying in Nineveh, right? Jonah and Nineveh. Huh?
We know that. We know that Jonah was a conditional, but Ezekiel's prophecies are not conditional.
Unless specified.
Not Ezekiel.
Every prophecy is conditional unless it's specified. In other words, just like Jonah didn't tell the residents of Nineveh that you even had an opportunity to repent. He said, get ready because the Almighty is going to destroy this place. They knew. They knew intrinsically our job is to repent. They repent and God did not destroy them. So that applies to every prophecy unless specified. Because God is a just God. He doesn't want to destroy us. He wants us to mend our ways and return to Him. So
let me point out another couple of verses which I use to illustrate the point that there's not condition attached to these. In Ezekiel 37:23 it says, neither shall they defile themselves anymore, which means that they will be in the nations. Maybe they are Christians, maybe they are Muslims, maybe they're something else, maybe they're Buddhist, doesn't matter. And then it goes on in 24 and says, and David my servant shall be king over them. So, I don't see any conditions there. That's unconditional prophecies.
That's also conditional.
How?
When the Almighty tells King Solomon that I will establish your throne forever, we know that was conditional to him walking in the path of God. Everything is conditional or that it overrides our free will. This idea that they will no longer defile themselves, do you think that the Almighty is in some way going to give us all lobotomies and not cause us to sin? Of course not, right? Because everything is conditional, and that's what's great about it, because that is how we can really prove to the Almighty who we really are and how much we really love Him. In other words, I never understood this whole notion of a messianic age of people who only know to do good. I mean, it just seems
I don't think so.
not idyllic.
No, it's not to do with only do good, because as long as man has free will, he will still be able to, not necessarily, but he can still sin. So therefore, I do not think that, I mean, you're relating the prophecies of the Book of Chronicles. I do not think that there's a correlation between the Book of Chronicles and David, my servant, because here the rabbis, they kind of try to interpret this as a Messiah and the Messianic kingdom in the future. That is, David, to them, is not literally King David, but is a Messiah, maybe a son, maybe, somebody that's down the line. I certainly don't buy that, because I don't follow that line of thought and reason, because when God says and puts a name there, then that name has to be the person there. Period.
So you think that David is going to rise from the dead and become king again?
Absolutely. David has every right to rise and become a king. Absolutely, 100%. No doubt about it in my mind. But what I'm saying is that when God gives a description, we can put many interpretations around it and color them, but God hasn't colored them. Yeah, there may be room for, sometimes there's ambiguity in the prophecies and it's hard to understand, but other times God clarifies these things so we can understand. So therefore, I think that a lot of the rabbis out there, maybe for rightly or maybe for wrong reasons or agendas-based interpretations, they have colored the interpretations and they have misled the people. But that's going to be rectified.
So when King David gets resurrected, is he ever going to die again?
If he gets resurrected, why would he die? Because the whole notion of the Messianic kingdom is that it's an everlasting kingdom. And we read Isaiah 65, and we can read about the people that sin and what their ages will be. That they will be limited in ages, people who sin, and then it also talks about those that will live on. So
we believe that's hyperbolic. I mean, there's a lot of things that are hyperbolic and conditional. Now,
I do not believe it's hyperbolic.
The notion of King David never dying, again, ties into this notion of a perpetual perfection that would ultimately contradict free will, which is why the Messianic age...
If it was perpetual, Rabbi Asher, then there would be no need for the ceremonial things that need to be done in the third temple. Because, many people don't even follow that belief that there will be a third temple. So because the issue is a relationship with God, therefore the temple will be there for those things that will occur to mend the relationship, so that people will still make mistakes, but the relationship will be mended. And that's one of the functions of the temple that Ezekiel mentions.
In the story, I believe it's in 2 Samuel, when it's speaking about Solomon ultimately building the temple and the throne of Solomon being established, alongside Solomon's throne is also mentioned the throne of David. It said that Solomon is ultimately sitting on the throne of David. So the throne of David is mentioned even when David is alive.
Yes, it is.
And it's continually mentioned after his death. So why should we assume that the mentioning of the throne of David just doesn't mean someone in the likeness of King David? King David was ultimately Israel's first and last righteous king. And he's really the archetype.
No, he wasn't the first king, because the first king was Shaul.
The righteous king.
Shaul was righteous as well when he started. He was very righteous.
Doesn't necessarily say he was righteous. King David was one unto God's own heart. It was clearly that he was meant to be king. But the reason that Samuel chose Saul was because that's what the people wanted. But that wasn't, as it says in Deuteronomy chapter 17, the king that God chose.
No, of course not. But nevertheless, if you look at the man and his character, at the time he was king, he was a righteous man. But later down...
He wasn't a wicked man. I mean,
as things happened, he strayed away, and things, caused him to let astray. And so therefore, because King David had to be brought to the throne, so something had to be done in God's ultimate wisdom and, omniscience. He had to do something in which way he had to bring David onto the throne, and that's what happened.
So we believe, at least my group believes, that there's a hierarchy in Scripture. The Torah is the basis for everything we believe. In other words, a prophet could not introduce a new law, a new required belief, Everything has to stem from Torah. The job of the prophet is only to bring Israel back to Torah. Now, the Torah never mentions a perpetual anything, with the exception of a continual exile and redemption, which seems that will continue to happen for all existence. Deuteronomy chapter 28, 29, 30, Leviticus chapter 26, the words we read there, the only thing we could assume by the simple meaning is that is to happen over and over again, that there is no perpetual age of peace or anything. As a matter of fact, every verse that people use to point to some messianic age is just redemption, because those statements are made when Israel's in exile. So Israel being brought back to their former glory is in some way, in some poetic, symbolic, hyperbolic fashion, painted like an age where people won't sin, and where the knowledge of God will fill the earth like the waters of the ocean.
You do not
fill the sea.
In that case, I think from what you're saying is that are you suggesting that if it was a King David or a likeness of King David, that they will be able to sin and die? Is that what you're,
Absolutely. I mean, for God to be just.
Right.
In other words, it's a merit system. If you keep the Torah, God will reward you, but He's not going to override your free will and cause you not to sin. I mean, who would really want to live in some sort of place?
God will never do that. He's not going to cause you, He's not going to override, just as you said, He's not going to override your free will. Free will always be there. Which means if free will wasn't there, why would Ezekiel be talking about the prince being a sacrifice into the temple? So therefore, free will has to allow you these things that, in other words, you can sin if you want to, but you have the choice not to, according to Torah. Now, that's always going to be there. But I think then doesn't that lead to a quandary? I think we're going to have to do another talk on this regards prophecy, because that will lead to a quandary where we will never have a messianic age or an age where there'll be peace on the earth.
But the Torah doesn't mention a messianic age. That's the thing. Now, peace is promised all through the Torah itself. One of the rewards for keeping Torah is peace. In other words, when we're distraught in exile, the only thing we can think about is that opportunity of peace that we missed by not keeping Torah. So, of course, the prophet's going to say that if Israel keeps Torah again, you're going to have peace. But he's going to make it sound great. I mean, the Rambam gives an example. Now, this is just his opinion, that when it says that the lamb will lie next to the lion, doesn't mean that's actually going to happen, but that's a parable saying that the lamb is Israel and the lions are the nations of the world, and that they will live in peace. We don't have to understand it like that, because we know that not even a prophet could add anything to the Torah. Now, the Torah never mentions things like this. I believe in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 11, he says that if I don't speak the words of Torah, there is no light in my speech. In other words, the job of the prophet is only to amplify Torah. Now, he's going to make it sound as sweet as possible for the people to absorb it the best. But he's not in any way introducing a new idea. However, you have adopted this new idea to believe that there is in some way a king who's going to rise from the dead, and the people will willingly not want to sin.
No, it doesn't necessarily have to be that he rises from the dead, because there are two ways to look at it. Number one, that a righteous man will be born from the tribe of Judah who will reign as king, and it will be from the line of David. Second interpretation is it may be King David himself, because just as righteous people who died like Daniel the prophet, King David, and other people, there is no reason why they are not as much, Messiah. What is Messiah? Messiah is basically an anointed person. Nothing special about Messiah other than he's a king. He has to, implement justice. And that is a Melech Zadeh. And so, other religious systems like Christianity, they twist and turn that to make it a new priesthood and all that. But nevertheless, there is actually room for that interpretation.
Mm-hmm. I believe in a Messiah, by the way. But I believe in it the way the Torah requires us to believe in it. In other words, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, towards the end, it says, when you want a king for yourself, you will elect a king that I will choose, that God will choose.
Sure.
And that's it. Now, rabbinic law introduced the idea that kings are anointed. The Torah never mentions that we anoint kings. It mentions priests, but not kings. In Nach, it mentions that even prophets are anointed.
Yeah.
It's most likely with different oil than the high priest was anointed with, but this idea was blown out of proportion, and this Ubermensch came out, this Messiah that some say won't die, but that some say died for your sins and is coming back, that some say is God himself. It was blown out of proportion when Israel was in a tough spot, when Israel was being persecuted by their oppressors. So if the Torah is our basis, I don't think anyone would ever compile the individual that we call the Messiah nowadays with the words of Torah alone. It's just not there. The Torah just tells you to keep Torah, and you know what? According to the plain understanding of Torah, there could be 100 temples. There could be 1,000 temples, because man will continue to sin. And if we sin, we're going to be exiled again. And then we'll repent, we'll be brought back. This is actually our third exile. This is not our first exile. I mean, the first exile was the northern kingdom. However, the northern kingdom never repented, so they never came back. Our second exile was in Babylon. The Israelites in Babylon repented. They came back with Ezra and Nehemiah. They experienced a time of peace, but they fell back, and they were exiled again. And now we're waiting for another redemption. It's really circular in nature. It'll happen over and over again because that's what Torah states. Now, we shouldn't view the books of the prophets and the books of the writings on the level of Torah. They cannot introduce any new idea. Their only job, compiled by the elders, who we consider the judges and the rabbis, they sanctioned their existence only to bring us back to Torah. Only to bring us back to Torah. But since the compilation of Nach, like of the Nevi'im and Ketuvim, it really gave birth to all these offshoots that created new religions, not off the words of the Torah, but off the hyperbolic sentences of the prophets. And that's a big problem. And I think that a lot of your eschatological beliefs comes from the words of the prophets and not from the Torah itself.
But they do, because, I believe in the prophets as the mouthpiece of God, and I have to look at that. Not that, I'm not saying that the prophets are overriding the Torah. The prophets are actually going a step further and illustrating certain principles that are already in the Torah that are not explained. So the prophets go one step further, and it's like a little commentary that the prophet explains, this is what will happen. In addition to what you've already been told, this is what's going to take place. And I believe my eschatological view is very much in line with the prophets of Israel, and I hold to that.
I don't think there's an example of a prophet in some way tying in a prophecy to some Torah statement, with the exception of Israel turning back. In other words,
well, everything is, Rabbi Asher, you said that earlier, everything is related back to the Torah. So there is no prophecy that could be held if people didn't repent and turn back. Now, for instance, the verse Ezekiel 37:23 says that they shall defile themselves. Neither shall they defile themselves anymore. Well, if what you're saying, then that contradicts that particular verse, because here God is saying that they're not going to defile themselves any longer. That's it. That's a stop point. But what you're saying.
So the problem is not with the statement. The problem is not with the statement. The problem is with its interpretation. In other words, if we compare it back to the Torah, and we know that the Torah never mentions that man's going to stop sinning, then it must not mean that. Then it's just hyperbolic. Then it's symbolic. Don't forget, it's the men of the Great Assembly who ultimately compiled these books, and according to some opinions, wrote them with their own hands. Why? To bring us back to Torah. The Torah never sanctioned other books to be written. No, especially other books that we would consider divinely inspired. Right? So if it was only to bring us back, this prophet, first of all, in Judaism we don't believe in the progressive revelation. Our revelation ended with the Almighty ending his transmission through Moses. And that's it. Right. So anything new is optional to believe and ultimately disposable. Our job is to keep the Torah. And the job of the prophet is to bring us back. Now, I don't believe that prophecy ended. And there's many rabbis. The Rambam also didn't believe that prophecy ended. There's prophets nowadays. Right. I believe that you could be a prophet. The job of the prophet, like you said, is to be the mouthpiece of God. However, God has already told us everything he had to tell us in the 5 books of Moses. There's nothing new he could tell us. As a matter of fact, every offshoot that exists today just reiterates, for their ethical basis, just reiterates the words of the Torah.
Sure. But I hold to the words of the Torah quite strictly as well, where the God of Israel says in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 3, that it says that, it talks about, in verse 2, about the people returning to the Torah. And then it says that if you obey my voice and you do what I've told you, it says, I will then restore your captivity back. And I'll have compassion on you and your children. So, I mean, I see that, you're basically saying that could be repeated. Potentially, yes. We are not told that will be repeated, but we are told that when our people in the nations, they repent and they return, meaning they go back to the Torah, that God will have compassion upon them and their children. Now, it doesn't say that they will be keeping a perfect Torah. Nowhere the Torah itself mentions that they're a perfect Torah. What it says is that the people have to have a heart to turn back to God. And we know which God is talking about. It's not talking about the God of Islam, the God of Christianity. It's talking about only one God, the God of Israel. Mm-hmm. So I think, different ways to look at it. We may agree or disagree, but I believe that we can't just reject the prophets. Mm-hmm. Torah, of course, Torah is, everything is built upon Torah. That is the foundation. But
I don't reject the prophets, by the way.
No,
I just interpret them differently.
See them as, elevating themselves above. So I just don't see that. And I see that they clarify a lot of points, whereas Torah doesn't clarify many points. Mm-hmm. Sometimes summarizes it.
Mm-hmm. I understand the prophets contextually in the time they lived and the people they spoke to. And their job on this earth, which was only to bring Israel out of captivity or to prevent Israel from going into captivity. That was their job, which is why these prophecies don't arise when Israel is prospering. But why, during the reign of Solomon, don't we have prophets speaking on things that people today would consider eschatological? Why? Sure. Because every generation, post the compiling of Tanakh, feels that they're living in the end days. Why? Because they're misinterpreting words that were contextually given to a certain group of people at a certain time and reapplying them. Now, mind you, the rule of double interpretation doesn't exist in Torah. That's a Christian invention. That they believe that Isaiah 7:14 was given to Isaiah and spoken to someone at that time, but was also applicable in the Gospels.
No, I
but anyway.
Yeah, right. I think you're relating to the point of Yeshua, Jesus, being certain prophecies in Isaiah that they try to apply back to Yeshua and say that they apply to him, etc. I understand that point.
But they say that they apply to him as well. So I don't think this rule exists. Also, in terms of rabbinic law, I don't want you to think that I believe that the Talmud or the Mishnah was in some way all given on Mount Sinai. Those in more academic yeshivas.
Sure. They're academic. They're more or less academic, and in discussions between the rabbis of the past. I do not uphold. Talmud is not holy book, and neither is a Mishnah. So really, to me, that's just a crass point. It's not even relevant.
I never called it a holy book. I don't believe it's a holy book. However, like I said, everything we believe. There's a lot of Jews who say a lot of things. But everything, like I said, has to go back to the Torah. Now, in the first chapter of Deuteronomy, also Deuteronomy chapter 17, also in the book of Numbers, God instructs Moses to establish a court of 70 elders, 71 with himself. Now, Jethro also makes reference to such a court, but Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 8 says that in matters of law that you have dispute in, that you don't understand, it says that you shall take it to the Kohen, to the Shofet, also to the Levim of that time, and they shall adjudicate it for you, and what they tell you will be Torah. In other words, Torah just means instruction, but it literally says it calls their decisions Torah, and it commands us not to stray from the right or to the left of what this court instructs us, and it says that by not obeying them, we would not be obeying God. Now, in Judaism, we call this the Isser of lo tasur, of not straying. Now, we believe, as mentioned in Tanakh, in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 14, also in other instances that mentions a court, we believe that this court existed all the way from Torah times till the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, what we call oral law is rabbinic law. In other words, it was the job of these judges to establish laws and fences for Israel to progress in a uniform manner. In other words, there had to be some consensus deciding how do we keep Shabbat, what's an actual melacha, how do we keep Yom Kippur. Civil law, very similar to politicians today, in some way creating civil law. However, we know the Torah says,
you know that nothing was written down, until,
Sort of. It says in Torah, Lo tosef alav v'lo tigram imenu. Don't add or take away from my commandments. Everything developed by this court could not be called Torah. Torah in the sense that it was given on Mount Sinai. So,
I understand that.
This law was called rabbinic law, not Torah law. Right when someone calls rabbinic law or Torah law, they're violating the Isur of being a Baal Tosif, of someone who adds to the Torah.
Yes. That's my point. That's my point about rabbinic law. It's not Torah law.
Right. It's not Torah law. However, it's sanctioned by the Torah that we must obey, even though it's man-made. So, oral law is rabbinic law.
No, I'm not so sure about that it's sanctioned by the Torah, because then Christians could hold to that view, and they will say that in Matthew 23, it talks about, listening to the rabbis.
It's exactly what it means in Matthew 23. It says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit at Moses' feet, do what they tell you, but don't do what they do, because they were hypocrites, according to the context there.
But
in other words,
again, it depends how you interpret it, because, in the Shem Tov edition, it says he. He meaning Moses and Torah. It's not talking about rabbinic law. That's how you interpret it that counts.
I'm not using the New Testament to in some way justify the establishment of oral law, but this law...
Christians can use that argument as well and say that, just as a rabbinic law is, as you just said earlier, that, is sanctioned by the Torah, and therefore you have to agree or believe in it. I'd say no, I reject that notion. No, it's not sanctioned by the Torah, not at all. It says that the Levite in the gate will be the one that will settle disputes. Well, here is a Levite sitting in front of you. Well, bring the dispute and I'll settle it for you. That's what Yahweh has said. God himself has said, a Levite will settle the dispute, I will settle it.
It specifically says the judge, the priest,
and the day.
Right, in that day. Absolutely. And it says that they will judge from the place that God will choose. Now, God chose different places till the tabernacle, that what was later known as the temple, stood in Jerusalem.
So Shiloh for many years, Shiloh for many years was the
absolutely. Just in other words, that was the place where this great court judged from, or what was initially known as the elders. So this is why you really can't give a judgment nowadays, because we're in exile. In other words, one clause in that whole pasuk is that we will judge in the place that God will choose. So right when God exiles you from that place, you no longer have any power. This is why rabbis today have no power. But the last court that had a power was the court that was known as the Sanhedrin, that traced their lineage all the way back to Joshua, to Moses. Right. It says that God was going to put on the elders and on Joshua what he put on Moses. Now this process was called smicha, basically ordination.
Yes.
And it was passed down from teacher to student all the way to the men in the Sanhedrin, the same scholars that appear in the Talmud. This was their claim to authority. This is why they had civil authority in Israel. Don't forget, even in the New Testament, just to use it as a historical reference, Jesus was taken to the Temple Mount. Why? Because in the room of hewn stones, in the Lishkat Hagazit, is where the Sanhedrin stood and adjudicated law. Now, every commoner in Israel knew the Sanhedrin was established by Moses, and thus they had civil authority. And when the Almighty was unhappy with them, he exiled them. There was no temple. They ultimately had no authority, and that line was broken, which is why smicha ended as a practice in the 3rd century of the Common Era. Now, this is what rabbinic law is. There's many Karaites who will teach that rabbinic Jews believed that the whole Talmud was given on Mount Sinai. That itself is heresy. Now, there are certain laws that we believe that may have been transmitted also on Sinai and just not written down. But even the Rambam, who mentions this idea, limits it to around 30 laws, and this is what he calls halacha la Moshe Sinai. Halachot that were given to Moses that must have come from a divine source, because we don't have any record of it being created. You would agree that there's practices in Tanakh that don't appear in Torah, right? For example, there was a prohibition of not buying and selling on the Sabbath, right? Yeah. I mean, there are things that the Torah doesn't mention.
Earlier, the Tanakh basically elaborates a little bit further than from where the Torah stops.
Well, then it would be adding unless it had some authority to establish such a practice. For example, anointing kings. Now, there was a body that had a ruling power over this, over these decisions, even the decision to codify certain books or compile certain books in some type of canon. This is why the Jewish people were able to accept the books of Tanakh outside of the Torah when the Torah never sanctioned these books. Why? Because there was a ruling body that took a consensus.
But you have to agree that the ruling body that was in Israel back in the day, ancient times when we had the Second Temple, they had already agreed to what they believed, what today we call the Tanakh, the Old Testament, is that these are the canonical, or, I don't know if the inspired word is the correct word to use because that's thrown around by Christians a lot. But, they believed that these were the oracles of God. They all agreed with that. There were other books that they agreed also. They kept as histories, for example, the book of Yeshar, the book of Jubilees, which today many don't even follow. But, so, the temple did. The temple kept these books.
That's fine. Yeah, but it was a man-made decision, correct? I mean, not to consider these as the oracles of God. I'm pretty sure.
It was. But God was, God orchestrated that decision for them.
I mean, it was a civil court, and they make mistakes. I mean, they're humans. But
of course they are.
But the reason...
But the high priest had access, had equal access to God to ask the question, using the Ummim and the Thummim. So maybe they...
All right, so we're believing that in faith. The Torah doesn't mention this. I mean, I'm just saying that they have the authority to come up with these ideas. If they were directly transmitted to them by God, is a statement of faith. I mean, it could have been, it could have not been. However, the reason the books of the prophets were even compiled to begin with, read and distributed amongst Israel, was because during the Syrian Greeks, during the time of the Maccabees, they outlawed the study of Torah. So the only things they were allowed to study were the books of the prophets.
Yeah.
And we have the practice today. I mean, the practice of reading the Haftorah, basically a passage of the prophets that coincides with that weekly parsha. Since this was instituted, this is the beginning of offshoots in the Jewish world. This is when the Sadducees arose. This is when the Gnostics, this is when the Christians were created, because they started building their ideas off the hyperbolic passages in the prophets instead of the simple text in the Torah.
No, I agree with that. I mean, there's no doubt about that there were many offshoots that came out. If you went to Africa, there were Jews living in a different way there. If you went to Yemen, Jews were living totally different to the Jews in Israel at the time. So there were many offshoots. And to this day, they probably are still, that don't, adhere to each other's views, opinions about prophecy and Torah laws. There are these differences. And I personally believe that God allowed these differences. And God allowed the people to make these decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And if God wanted everybody to be, like a robot and follow, one interpretation, then God could have done that too, but He didn't do that. So there have to be different opinions.
I think that the establishment of this court, or the main reason this court was established, was to prevent offshoots. Because if we're splintered, we have no effect socially, which is ultimately the whole reason of entering or remaining in the covenant. And this is what was mentioned to Abraham, that his descendants would be like the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky, and ultimately that the whole world will be blessed through him. In other words, this is not going to happen if we're splintered. So for ceremonial issues, this court was elevated and established by the Almighty to get us progressing in a uniform manner. Now, if God didn't want the splintering to occur, then the court would have always been there, but that's not the case. So I would say that there was room for that. That's the huge downfall of being in exile. However, the Talmud tried to rectify that. In other words, Yehuda Hanassi compiled the rulings of this court in one manual called the Mishnah,
Right.
made up of different volumes to take to the Jew in exile. Because there was no centralized governing body, the Jews were able to take Torah or the application of Torah with them wherever the exile took them. And this is why rabbinic law is so important. Now, yes, it's wrong to call rabbinic law Torah law, but to say that it's not useful...
Karaites would disagree with you on that, and I would also disagree with that.
Right, and the Karaites, they probably make up less than 1% of the Jewish world because of that.
It doesn't matter. One man is equal to a million. One is, can take on the whole tribe of Israel. So based on that,
not in terms of influence. There's power in numbers.
What did God say in the book of Malachi? The Torah is in the mouth of the Levite, and my covenant is with him forever. Now, don't tell me that forever means, only till the exile or after the exile. Forever is ever. It's forever. It doesn't change. Now, God also talks about his covenant in the Torah. He elaborates it in the book of Malachi. Now, my point is this, that the Levite is elevated. Like it or not, he is elevated, he's separated, and he's supposed to hold the Torah. Now, you're telling me that, a Levite's going to follow what Judah Hanassi wrote?
No. Okay, wait a minute. But they were Levites and Kohanim in the court. As a matter of fact, the Nasi initially was always a Kohen Gadol. He represented the legal arm of the Beit Din Hagadol. Now, during the times of the Second Temple...
Judah Hanassi really was.
Wait. Hold on one second.
Yeah.
During the time of the Second Temple, the priesthood became corrupted. And ultimately, they didn't want anything to do with the Sanhedrin. Were in Rome's pocket. So, because the command in Deuteronomy chapter 17 mentions judges, Levites, and Kohanim, the judges could step in and fill the role of the Nasi. So, Yehuda Hanassi was, like his name states, the Nasi of that generation, of that Sanhedrin,
right.
And took it upon himself to gather all the notes of this court. I mean, mind you, in the Talmud, there are Leviim, there are Kohanim. I mean, even Jews nowadays. I mean, yourself, you're a Kohen. But it ultimately doesn't mean nothing if you're not following in God's ways. And we know the priesthood...
I don't deny that at all. I believe that Torah is central, and I agree with you that Judah Hanassi was the, judge or leader at the time, and he compiled these books. But what he compiled was no different to what the Muslims have compiled. Reams and reams of texts of what the Prophet Muhammad said to his disciples, and we have 600,000 texts. And so what he did,
it's very similar. Right, to the Hadith.
Look, I'm telling you, it's no different to the Hadith. So, I know Islamic law very well and Jewish law as well. So,
right.
To me,
it's completely analogous.
You cannot raise Judah Hanassi's opinions that he gathered opinions of rabbis. Different rabbis, different interpretations. I have the Mishnah in front of me. I have Rambam's, Mishnah Torah in front of me. And I've read those books, and all I find is reams and reams of opinions that sometimes... that no rabbi can come to a conclusion, what is right. It's different opinions.
That's not the case. When the rabbis came to certain conclusions, there are certain areas that are a bit ambiguous, but there needs to be a consensus for the Jewish people to flourish. We have to be keeping Yom Kippur and Shabbat on the same day, right? I mean, I always view the Karaite movement as an attempt to disorganize religion, and this is why they're so small in number, because they can't unite on anything. I mean, I can't eat over your house on Shabbat because you slaughter an animal differently. Your daughter can't marry my son.
I done this completely, Rabbi Asher, because Saadia Gaon, if you heard about him,
sure,
he was in the Middle East. And as you know, that he wrote a lot about, what was happening there in Iraq and other places. You can read his writings, you probably already have. But having said that, again, he had a view about Karaites as well and other people. I think that this view that Karaites are small, I think that's just
no, wait. Hold on one second. Rav Saadia Gaon lived around the 8th or 9th century, okay? So in his time, especially around Egypt, even in the time of the Rambam, that was the birth of the Karaite movement. and it was large at that time. But today, it's completely irrelevant.
But this term is thrown around by some rabbis. Like I heard Rabbi Tovia Singer say that the Karaites are completely destroyed, or there's only a small number because they didn't uphold the rabbinic law. I think that's total mumbo jumbo. To be honest, I'm sorry, I disagree with it. I don't
demographics don't lie. Karaites in America.
Let me tell you about my testimony. When God called me, God didn't tell me to follow rabbinic law. I was told to follow Moses. And that's where I stand.
But you're not really a Karaite. That's the thing.
I'm not a Karaite, but I respect the Karaites. Why? Because, maybe we disagree in certain points, but I know that they at least try to follow the Torah to the letter as well.
They include the prophets and the writings on the same level as the Torah, which is problematic. And they also themselves have built a consensus on what they allow and what they prohibit. So their attempt to disorganize rabbinic Judaism has just been replaced by their own form of oral law. In other words, they have a consensus among themselves.
It's disorganized, Rabbi Asher. It's already disorganized. It's all over the place.
It's the most organized form of Judaism that exists.
I don't agree with that, because I have seen, rabbinic Jews, they can't agree with each other. Two Jews have three opinions, that.
No, that is actually not true. Most Jews can even marry into their own families. There's a general consensus on what's allowed and what's not allowed because of the Mishnah. In other words, even the Reform movement. Now, the Reform movement is a very irreligious movement, but they agree that the basis...
You go look at Chabad, right, Rabbi Asher? You go look at Chabad and look at how they believe and behave. Their opinions are even, sometimes counter Torah, and they believe in all sorts of mysticisms, and as many Jews today, Kabbalah, and all sorts of hyperbolic things which have nothing to do with Torah or our forefathers.
The job of the Mishnah was to rule on legal issues, on either ceremonial or practical issues, not mystical issues. In other words, Jews could differ on mystical and metaphysical areas of Torah and Judaism. Right. However, in terms of how it's actually kept out, how it's played out, Judaism and the ceremonies, how Shabbat is kept, how Yom Kippur is kept, it's almost a monolithic understanding among the Jews on what's done on these days. And that is really the whole purpose of the oral law, to unite us in gray area, an area that the Torah doesn't mention. In other words, we don't need the rabbis to teach us how to be ethical. We don't need the rabbis to teach us how God functions or the secrets of the universe. If the Torah doesn't mention it, it's not sanctioned by God, and it's regulated to opinion and ultimately disposable. The job of the judge was to help us fill in the gray area so we can progress ceremonially in a uniform manner.
The Torah did sanction that there will be judges, who can act on the day, in our time, potentially in exile. And so they'll be able to make rulings according to our time. So, for instance, as you said rightly earlier, that, in exiles, there were
not in exile.
In Torah, in Israel time, and also in exile, because what's the point of the Levite being in the gate, and what's the point of the people, the community going to the Levite if they can't go in exile? I don't see the point Torah mentioning that.
It says that they were judged from the place that God will choose.
Well, God chose, as you rightly said, that for many years, 400 years, the tabernacle was at Shiloh, and then after that it went to Jerusalem. So God changed his places. God had his name in Shiloh, then he had his name in Jerusalem. It doesn't mean that his name is now resting in Jerusalem for eternity. God has his purposes all over the world. So wherever his name is, do we really know where God's name is today? Many people will say it's in Israel, it's in Jerusalem. Well, all sorts of idolatries are taking place there if it's in Jerusalem.
One of the penalties of being in exile is being disorganized and not having a central ruling body. Ultimately, because all we need is repentance, right? It's not going to enter to perfection, but it's going to put us on the right path. If every Levite that was to determine Jewish law the way he saw fit, that would be more fragmented than the Karaites. Because there's no Sanhedrin.
Interpret it according to Torah, not according to personal opinion.
But what does that mean? For the Torah is ambiguous in many areas. There has to be a consensus of what people think certain things are. How would you interpret a melacha? Right? The Torah doesn't tell us what work actually is. It says, don't do melachot. Rabbinic Judaism has interpreted that to mean 39 categories of creative labor. So whether it's true or not, it gets everyone progressing on the same page instead of saying, no, this is what it means. No, that's what it means. There has to be some harmony. This is why.
That is the rabbi's opinions at the end of the day, what they created.
For sure. But it was sanctioned.
Rules of, work.
Absolutely. It was sanctioned in the Torah.
Right. It's not sanctioned in the Torah. However, I'm not saying that oral law is all bad, but what I'm saying, there are good points, there are good discussions, there are good rulings in the oral Torah. However, they don't always, are locked into Torah, basically. Sometimes they move away, very far away from Torah. And that doesn't...
Can you think of an unethical ruling in oral Torah?
No, I wouldn't say it's necessarily unethical, but I'm just saying that from a point of view, if we are going to couple that to the Torah, they don't always couple back. That's my point.
This is why we need a consensus of scholars to decide, and this is what these judges were. And these judges were sanctioned in the Torah. Deuteronomy 17 mentions these judges that the Almighty ordered Moses to gather, these elders that would decide law in front of the tabernacle.
But you know that we are fragmented people today, Rabbi Asher. It's not possible to...
We're in exile.
We don't have a central Sanhedrin or a temple, for that matter.
But we have the Mishnah, and the Mishnah are the rulings of this court.
Okay, so let's take the Mishnah. Let's take Rambam's Mishnah Torah. Let's take, Ramban's, writings.
Just the Mishnah.
Okay, we have the Mishnah. We have the writings. We can look at that and we can say that, this is how rabbis interpreted the Torah in the 2nd century. Different commandments are related and how, different rabbis saw it. And some of them came to consensus, other times they didn't. So there's different facets of the law. That kind of gives us an idea. It's good to read. It's good to get an understanding. Nothing wrong with that. Then we still have to go back to the Torah to really make sense of it. Now let me ask you a simple question. Did God give us a way to slaughter the animals in the Torah? Did Leviticus 11 ever say how to slaughter an animal?
It's not clear how to slaughter cattle exactly. And when it says to slaughter them in the way that I instructed you, that can mean covering the blood. That can mean many different things. There had to be a consensus by the judges, by the elders, how animals were to be slaughtered. There had to be a consensus of us slaughtering animals in the exile. And the Torah only mentions slaughtering animals for sacrifices, but sacrifices were eaten. So what do we do? So when we have no temple and we have no sacrifices, does that mean that we can't eat meat? This is why that we need a court to decide these things. Now, the rulings of that court, at least the rulings that appear in the Mishnah, these rulings were not developed only in the time of the Mishnah. They were bringing down laws that existed in fluid form all the way going back to Moses, Joshua.
Let me go back to a particular law of the Mishnah, and which appears in the Gemara and Talmud as well, which says that it talks about Noah and the ark, and it talks about how God, turned Ham into the...
That's not a law, by the way. That's not a law. That's a Midrash.
So,
okay, do it now.
The Midrash, right, is totally false. It's totally...
Wait, no, hold on. Not totally. There's beautiful things in Midrashim. No, right, I'm just... Midrashim. Folklore and legend.
It's just legend.
I'm very familiar with that statement. All right.
Poor rabbi out there who didn't have nothing to do, he decided to invent that story. Now you got the Jewish world holding to that story, so therefore...
No, the Jewish world doesn't hold to that story, by the way. In the Talmud, there's something called Agadah. So Agadah is also called Midrash, folklore and legend. So there's a lot of tales in there that are not sanctioned by the Torah. They're just tales that crept into rabbinic literature where they have nothing to do with oral law. You can take those stories and throw them away.
I agree.
Right? Why?
Some people use those stories against the other people. Racist.
It's not the oral law. The oral law has to contain law. Law is what we do. Halacha lemaseh, actual works that you do, not what you believe. Believing...
Torah Shevel Pei is a lot of rabbis' opinions. It doesn't necessarily couple. And from what I have seen, what I have studied and read, it doesn't always couple back to the Torah. Yes, they have made an attempt, a good attempt to maybe understand the Torah, maybe, try to bring a central body and where the people can agree. But, both you and me know that rabbis disagreed with each other throughout the ages. In Rambam's time, Rambam wasn't liked by many people. They called his writings heretical.
But the Rambam wasn't on the Sanhedrin. I mean, he lived in the 11th century.
No, I know that Rambam lived in the 11th century, but I'm just giving you a point of view that somebody...
Nothing's perfect, but it sure beats everyone interpreting Torah the way they see fit. And it's helped us till today. I mean, the Jews are on the same page ceremonially because of the Mishnah. It ultimately helped more than it ever hurt. Now, yes, there's a lot of stupid stories in there. There's a lot of beautiful stories. Those stories are secondary. That's not Torah Sheba'al Peh. Torah Sheba'al Peh is Torah, instruction. Separate from Torah Shebektav.
The Agadah, is kind of become part and parcel of rabbinic law and folklore as well. So the question is, it's very difficult for people to separate that. Saying,
Absolutely.
This part is Agadah,
Absolutely.
and this part is, Torah, and this part is ceremonial. It's very difficult to separate that, Rabbi Asher, but I understand your point, though.
That makes up the core of all I teach. I always try to make a distinction. I tell people, that's just a midrash, or that's Kabbalah. Now, Kabbalah is also, but basically all these metaphysical stories that many times contradict the Torah and try to rewrite the Torah. Now, that's very problematic, and I believe that's actually what the Sadducees were against. I don't believe the Sadducees were against the oral law, because the Sadducees also sat on the Sanhedrin and also developed civil law. But they were against many of these stories, these legends that crept in and gave the Torah a mystical twist with good intentions, right? But ultimately, they ended up hurting the story. And this is why Jews nowadays feel like they have some obligation to someone who has Jewish DNA. Why? Because Kabbalah taught that there's something called the Jewish soul, right? That's very problematic. The Torah doesn't mention this. I mean, the Torah separates the world between good and evil and not between Jew and non-Jew. I mean, the idea is that if you keep Torah, you're good. And if you don't keep Torah, whether you're Jewish or Hebrew or not, you're part of the problem. So I argue for a necessity of this oral law. However, it's been grossly misunderstood to mean other things, like the story you mentioned that's very racist about someone being cursed with black skin, or it's completely secondary. This is why the Rambam codified the halachot in his work called the Mishnah Torah. So the Mishnah Torah are all the laws of the Sanhedrin that appear in the Mishnah, extracted from other Agadot. In other words, he understood.
I respect, Rambam's, Mishnah Torah. I think he tried to clarify the point. He tried to, get to the people an understanding from what the Mishnah had written, and probably other rabbis did as well at the time. But having said that, I'm not saying that Mishnah Torah doesn't have a place, or the Mishnah doesn't. I believe it does. I believe it has a merit. But what I believe is solely and wholly to rely on that is not the way that, the God of Israel has intended us to be.
I think that you could progress so much more if you would join the greater body of Rabbinic Judaism with your message. In other words, if you have a consensus of people practicing the same way you do, ceremonial portions in the Torah, which is all Rabbinic Judaism tries to provide the Jewish world, a ceremonial interpretation on how we keep ceremonial laws in Torah, then you can do so much more. But it seems that what you believe is really not held by anyone else. I mean,
it doesn't matter because I'm a Levite. I'm not everybody else. It doesn't matter because my revelation from God is totally different to your revelation and other people's. So I have to.
But we're working together here.
God that called me. That's my remit is to the God that called me. And nobody, Job Blogs didn't come and knock on my door. Christians didn't come knock on my door and say, come follow me. God knocked on my door. So my remit is only to me.
I've always taught that walking with God doesn't mean much if you're walking alone. And I think that
I don't mind
the reason the Almighty,
I can walk alone as well.
I think the reason the Almighty used the family to catapult his message to the world was because there's strength in numbers. And if you want to make this world a better place, it's going to take a group of people moving towards one goal. And one person alone is not enough. So this is why, at least uniting on ceremonial issues.
Yeah, but Moses was one person. There was no strength in numbers there.
Moses was called to lead a nation.
And so you see, therefore, right, I was called to lead Torah, people back to the Torah, not to form strength in numbers, I do not follow that line of thought, neither did my forefathers. So I agree.
I think it's more realistic.
From a moral point of view, I think you have a point. Yes, there is strength in numbers, and there is, more strength if you have the same message solidified. You can then perhaps, do more good, as you're saying. But I also believe that, when God called out certain people, and with certain messages, that message had to be taught, irrespective of whether there was strength in numbers or not.
I would say that your message doesn't differ in any way, ethically, from the message of any other rabbi in America, ethically, which is what ultimately matters. Now, ceremonially it does. However, because of the ceremonial, that you're willing to be less effective, to insist on interpreting ceremonial law on your own.
I would disagree with that, because I have been to more countries, and I have had the privilege to bring more people to the Torah than any person that I know of in many different countries. So I disagree with that I am less effective, because my effect is only as much as Hashem has allowed me to be effective.
Well, less effective doesn't mean that you're not effective. It just means that you could be more effective.
No. I am very effective, and I'm very successful in what I do. And
I'm not saying that you're not effective or successful. I'm just saying that you could be more effective and successful.
Sure. But again, certain people that he has called out, he maybe doesn't want them to be with other groups, and maybe their message will get tainted. Maybe their message will become corrupted. So there is that issue as well that has to be looked at. So, for instance, it's not that I have a problem with, the Rabbinic Council of America or Rabbinic Council in Israel. I don't have any problems with them, generally speaking. Ethically, my message is no different to, like you said, any of the rabbis. However, my approach to reaching people is different. They're not going to approach Chinese in China because they are stuck to the Jews in America. Well, I will go to a Chinese person as well in China. My approach is different.
I don't think it's a coincidence that this huge revival of the nations coming back to Torah only really occurred with the rise of the internet, the dissemination of information, of basic Jewish information, being absorbed mainly online from people all over the world, and realizing the main thing that has kept the Jewish message monolithic till today. Now, when I mean the Jewish message, I mean the rabbinic Jewish message, is the oral law. If it wasn't for that oral law, Israel would have faded away a long time ago. But it seems...
Let me ask you the question then. If oral law is so good, why are we still in exile today?
Because Torah and oral Torah is not there to make you good. It's there to make you better, more effective. It's ultimately up to us to repent.
I mean, remember the our belief system is that in every generation there's righteous people, and then when we all repent together, this is a belief in Rabbinic Judaism that if we all repent together, that God will send Messiah and we'll be restored. How come that has never happened? Because from what you are telling me, that there's a monolithic message in rabbinic oral law, Torah Shebul Pei, and you're saying that, and that has been the case over the years. I don't disagree with that. I say, okay, fair point. But then
that's a monolithic ceremonial message. Israel wasn't exiled for not knowing what was required of them. Israel was exiled for knowing and not keeping what was required of them. So, with the same thing that exiled Jews during the first temple...
Torah, by the way. Torah only.
I'm sorry?
No, Israel was exiled for breaking Torah laws, not for breaking rabbinic Torah laws.
In terms of why they were exiled in the first temple, the closest inkling it mentions, and this is, it really takes some hermeneutics to come up with it, is for not keeping the Shemitah year. The notion of keeping the Shemitah year has a lot of intrinsic details that are not contained in the Torah. Like basically every Torah law needs some sort of explanation for it to be kept properly. I'm not elevating the laws of the rabbis alone. In other words, I'm not saying that they stand on themselves. The job of these laws are to bring you back to Torah and to preserve Torah and help you execute these laws in the most effective way out there.
If they help to do that, then Baruch Hashem, great. There's no problem with that.
They're there to help. I'm not trying to, in some way, replace Torah. If a Jew would intentionally choose not to follow the civil authorities making these ceremonial laws monolithic in some sense, then yes, I believe that on that basis, God himself would punish that individual and probably exile the nation if they all followed suit. We have an example in Shmos, I believe 20 verse 23, it says, don't follow the majority to do evil.
Yes, that's right.
Now this leads us to the understanding that if there's a majority pushing an effort to do good, then we should follow that majority. And the majority is always understood as the majority of the elders in Israel who sat in a court, who voted things into existence, who decided, you know what, we're going to interpret this in this manner, and not have everyone walk around with a Torah scroll under their arm and saying, oh, well, I reject your interpretation, because there's no progress in that. Now, there's a misunderstanding that the rabbis elevate the Talmud to the level of the Torah, or say that the Talmud is holy or divinely inspired or in some way replace the Torah. No, the job of the Talmud and the laws in the Talmud are there to help us progress ceremonially in a uniform manner. That's it. That's the oral law, and that's what makes you a rabbinic Jew. That's what makes me a rabbinic Jew. However, there's many rabbis out there.
I respect that. I'm not, against you in any particular way. Ethically, I think you have a good message. I got no problems with that myself personally.
I think that the Karaite movement nowadays is a reactionary movement because of rabbis out there not teaching rabbinic Judaism properly. I've heard many rabbis teach that all the laws were given on Mount Sinai, all the oral laws were given on Mount Sinai, and the Talmud is holy, and the Zohar is holy, and speaking on demons and all this nonsense. Right. That is the fault of Kabbalah.
I can't really speak for Karaites because I'm not a Karaite Jew. I think they'll have to, you'll have to consult or have an interview with a Karaite to get a more in-depth interview on that side. But yes, I see what you're saying. Although I can't really be a voice for them, I don't exactly know everything that they do. Why
for yourself. I think if you would embrace some form of rabbinic Judaism, at least to help you interpret these ceremonial passages with someone else. In other words, just so you can coexist and basically share some common ground with other Jews on ceremonial issues.
I don't have a problem with that personally on a common ground, even with the Karaites or with the rabbinic Judaism, because really I don't see either as my enemy. To me, they're both brothers to me. That everybody's trying to do the Torah to the best of their ability. So I really don't have any personal issues in that regard.
I just think that you would be so much more effective. In other words, if you were performing a marriage, what sort of contract would you fill out? How would you fill it out? What would you say? Right now, when something is rabbinic, developed by the rabbis, we're not going to call this divinely inspired. We're just going to say, for the sake of unity, this was voted into existence because the Sanhedrin ruled by vote. Right? Yeah. They voted things into existence, which is why they have no authority in the metaphysical. But if that was the case,
I don't really have a problem with what the Sanhedrin wrote and ordained. I really don't have a problem with them, but I do have a problem with certain things. For instance, you can't take the name of God. I have a problem with that.
I think that you would be a great asset to the Orthodox world, going where you go and speaking to the people you speak to. If you could give them one book to at least help them understand ceremonial law in a monolithic fashion.
And I'm more than happy to even do that. I'm not saying I won't do that. I will. There are people I have met who want to learn these things, and I'm more than happy to give them the book, on ceremonial law as you suggested. But again, I think the problem that I face is a lot of those people either don't speak Hebrew at all or they don't speak even English. So they want the book to be interpreted in their language of, what they speak. And that's where it becomes problematic. How do you do that? These books that are written, especially, the Mishnah or the Mishnah Torah, even if you took one book of the Mishnah, it becomes very difficult to interpret it in the language they speak. I think that's probably their requirement.
Many tribes in Africa.
I'm not the authority, to do the translation in their language, so it becomes extremely difficult for me to translate that book. I've translated I've translated from the Hebrew to English, and I've even attempted to have it translated into some other languages. successfully in Torah, in Arabic, for instance, the Torah in French. But having said that, I've had a great amount of difficulty translating. I'm talking about the Torah, which is out there, translating into some of the Asian languages. So I'm now thinking that if I was to take the Mishnah, like let's say not the whole Mishnah, let's take one book based on the ceremonial laws, or even let's just say based on the Shabbat laws. And then I find that somebody has to be capable to do that. And I don't know if we have people like that in our midst who can do that.
There's many tribes in Africa who, via the internet, via YouTube, they've reached out to a rabbi who acts, clearly, someone has to speak English there, but the Torah also wasn't translated in their language to begin with either. All this takes work, and this is why there's an understanding in the rabbinic world that the purpose of us being in exile is to bring more people to Torah in the languages of the nations that we're exiled to, right? In other words, if Israel fails to be a light from the base, from Jerusalem, from the land of Israel, God will make sure that we don't fail in our mission, and He exiles us.
Right.
So that we physically finish our task. I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I think that we should have another phone call in the future.
I'm not disagreeing with your the perspective, of purposes of taking Torah to the nations. I believe, you have a good, purpose, ethical purpose, and righteous purpose. I believe in that, but I also think that there are difficulties encountered, doing that. However, I'm not against, I consider Jews my brothers, all over the world, whoever they are, whatever ethnicity they are. I don't really care what color they are. I consider them my brothers. However, whatever contributions I can make in the places I can reach, I will do that. As, God leads me, I will definitely do that. And I think, I will probably leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a website or something that people could look up?
I have a website called forever-israel.com and wanderingisrael.com. In
that website, could people find access to the Torah you translated and other works?
Yes, they can, because, I do publish the Arabic Bible, the Arabic Torah free of charge over there. They can download it and they can read it, and if they speak Arabic, they can get understanding in that. So some of the books have been translated, but also if they need to, ask, like if they wanted a French Torah, then we have access to that. I've had the Bible, the one that I translated, at least Torah, I had that translated into French as well. So yes, we can provide that if somebody needs it. We also have a ministry to the prisons in America. We reach out to the prisons, to the inmates, whoever reaches out to us to assist them with Torahs, with books. We have been doing that for several years now, free of charge. We don't charge them. We send the books in free so these people can return back to the Torah. And there are many, from what I've heard, many encouraging reports that in prisons they're keeping the Shabbat. They're doing things that the Torah commands us, and I think that's a win-win situation for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're doing a great job, and keep up the good work, and thank you again for this time. We have to do this again, okay?
No worries. Thank you very much for the time given me, and you have a great evening, and of course, a great week ahead.
Okay, likewise, brother. Thank you. Be well.